Someone asks why you can't make it on Saturday. A simple answer would take 5 words. Instead, you give them 3 minutes. You explain your schedule. You explain the conflict that came up. You explain how it happened and why you couldn't have predicted it, and how much you genuinely wanted to be there. You explain that it isn't about them. You explain how bad you feel about it. And somewhere in the middle of explaining, you notice something strange. Nobody asked for any of this. In fact, if you stopped talking right there, the conversation would probably continue exactly the same way. They asked one question, a simple question, and you have been answering it for 3 minutes and you are still not done. This is what over-explaining looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a constant, quiet pressure to say more, to add one more sentence, to make absolutely sure they understand. You've probably done this today, in an email, in a text, in a conversation where someone asked something simple and you couldn't quite stop at the simple answer. This video is about why. At some point in childhood, your decisions were treated like arguments. Not every child experiences this. Some children are allowed to simply have preferences, to say no, to choose differently, to make a mistake, without having to justify it at length. Their "I don't want to" is accepted as information. It doesn't need to be defended. But some children grow up in environments where an unexplained choice is an unsafe choice. Maybe the adults around you responded to "I don't want to" with interrogation, with displeasure, with a silence that made it clear you needed to say more before things would be okay again. Maybe no was never enough on its own. It had to come with reasons, and the reasons had to be good enough, and good enough was a standard that shifted depending on the day. Maybe you watched what happened when someone in your house made a decision without explaining themselves, how it was treated as inconsiderate or selfish or careless. And you learned to preempt that. So you started explaining, before anyone asked, thoroughly, comprehensively. Because a well-explained decision was a safer decision. Because if you gave enough context, covered enough angles, there was less room for the verdict to go against you. You were not over-explaining because you were verbose. You were over-explaining because it worked. It reduced friction. It minimized consequences. In an environment where your choices were not automatically trusted, a detailed explanation was a genuinely effective strategy. The difficulty, as with so many of these patterns, is that you brought the strategy with you when you left. Here is what most people get wrong about over-explaining. They assume it's about wanting to be understood. It isn't, or not primarily. When you over-explain, you are not trying to make yourself clear, you are trying to make yourself safe. There is a meaningful difference, and it matters, because as long as you believe you're explaining for clarity, you will keep doing it, and you will keep finding that no amount of additional sentences ever quite resolves the feeling that you haven't said enough. There are 4 situations where this pattern tends to be most visible. The first is saying no. Someone asks you to do something. You can't, or you don't want to, and so you say no. But not just no. I can't because… And then the reasons begin. Why you can't. Why it's not personal. Why you wish things were different. Why under other circumstances you absolutely would. The no itself would have been sufficient. The person asked a question, and no is a complete answer. But no without explanation feels dangerous. It feels like it leaves too much room for interpretation, for them to decide what your no means about you. So you fill that room with words. The second is setting a boundary. Just so you know, the reason I'm doing this is, before you even name the limit, you pre-justify it. You explain your reasoning, your thought process, your intentions, as if the boundary itself requires a legal argument before it can be accepted. Boundaries are not proposals to be reviewed and approved. But if you grew up in an environment where your limits were regularly challenged or overridden, you learned to arrive at every limit already prepared for cross-examination. What's interesting is that over-explaining isn't most obvious when you're saying no. It's most obvious when you've done nothing wrong at all. The third is making a mistake. You get something wrong, and instead of a simple acknowledgement, "I got that wrong, I'm sorry," you produce an account, a detailed account, of what you were thinking, what you misunderstood, what you meant to do, why it happened the way it did, why it was, given the circumstances, understandable. The acknowledgement gets buried. What comes through instead is a defense. The fourth is making a preference known. "I'd rather eat somewhere else, but only because it's closer and I know you like that area too, and it's not that I don't like this place, I just thought..." A preference dressed up as a compromise, disguised as a suggestion, surrounded by so many qualifications that by the end of it, you're not sure you expressed a preference at all. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that wanting things required justification, that having a preference was the beginning of an argument, not the end of a sentence. Here is what connects all four of these situations. Over-explaining is not an attempt to be understood. It is an attempt to earn permission for things that don't require permission. You are not explaining because the other person needs the information. You are explaining because some part of you believes that without the explanation, they might decide you're wrong. Selfish. Too much, not enough. The explanation is a preemptive defense. You are arriving at the conversation already standing trial, already anticipating the verdict, and the words are your case for the jury to consider before it rules. People who over-explain often grew up feeling that their choices were treated like arguments, and if every preference, every no, every mistake was an occasion for interrogation, if nothing you decided was simply accepted, then adulthood can feel like a courtroom you never quite got to leave. The judge is no longer in the room, but you're still arguing your case. And this is why explaining more never fully resolves the feeling, because the feeling is not about information, it is about safety. And no amount of additional sentences will produce safety, because the threat you are defending against exists in memory, not in the room you are currently standing in. The person you're explaining to is not your interrogator. They almost certainly do not need 3 minutes to understand why you can't come on Saturday. But the child who once needed 3 minutes to make a no acceptable, that child is still composing the explanation, still trying to get it right enough that there won't be consequences. The exhaustion of it is easy to underestimate. Constructing a justification for every preference, every limit, every decision, that is costly in a way that accumulates quietly. By the end of a day of it, you are tired. Not from the decisions themselves, from the constant internal work of preparing them for scrutiny. There is also a paradox at the center of over-explaining. It tends to produce the opposite of what it intends. When someone offers an unprompted, detailed justification for a simple choice, the effect is not reassurance. It is uncertainty. It signals, to the other person, and to some degree to yourself, that you are not entirely sure you had the right to make that choice. Brevity, in most social contexts, reads as confidence. "I can't make it on Saturday," lands differently than 3 minutes of context. The explanation, intended to prevent judgment, can inadvertently invite more scrutiny, not less. And perhaps most significantly, over-explaining slowly erodes your relationship with your own decisions. If every choice requires external justification before it feels valid, you gradually stop trusting your own judgment. The approval of other people becomes the measure of whether you got it right. And that is an exhausting and uncertain way to live. If you recognize this in yourself, there is one shift worth practicing. Not, "Have I explained enough?" but, "Did I answer the question?" Those two questions feel similar. They are not. Have I explained enough? Has no answer. There is no point at which the explanation becomes complete, because the goal was never information. It was safety. And safety doesn't arrive with the next sentence. Did I answer the question? Has an answer. Yes or no. And usually the answer is yes, much sooner than you think. Someone asks if you can come on Saturday. The answer is, I can't make it, sorry. That's it. That is the complete answer. It contains everything that was asked for. What comes after it, the schedule, the conflict, the extensive expression of regret, that is not for them. That is for the part of you that still believes a plain no requires permission before it can be spoken. None of this means something is wrong with you. You became over-explaining because at some point, an explanation was the price of being okay in the room. Because the people around you, perhaps without awareness, perhaps without intention, treated your choices as arguments that needed to be won. And you became very good at winning them. That was real. The strategy worked. You navigated an environment where your inner life was not automatically trusted, and you did it by becoming fluent in justification. But that environment is gone. Your choices don't require a verdict anymore. You are allowed to want what you want, to say no without a paragraph, to make a mistake without constructing a defense, to have a preference without qualifying it until it disappears. The explanation was never the problem. The belief that you needed one to be okay, that was the inheritance. And inheritances, unlike biology, can be set down. If you recognized yourself in this, you're in good company. Most people who over-explain have been doing it so long they stopped noticing it was a choice. I'd be curious to know, where does it show up most for you? In texts, in emails, in conversations at work, or somewhere else? Let me know in the comments. And if this kind of content helps you understand yourself a little more clearly, subscribe. There's more to say.